Welcome back to my drive home from work. Thank you for joining me for this ride. So I've talked a lot on this channel so far about hormones, female reproductive hormones. We've talked about like cervical mucus and cool things like that. But I have not really gone back to the basics yet of what does female reproductive anatomy even look like? Like, what are we talking about here when I talk about the cervix, when I talk about the uterus, like the uterine lining? Like, where is all of that stuff? What does it look like? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So hi, my name is Haley. Thanks again for joining me on this ride. I work at an OBGYN clinic where I teach women and couples how to chart their reproductive cycles so that they can either achieve or avoid pregnancy, depending on what their intention is, and also so that they can maintain their fertility and the health of their fertility and be an active participant in that. So I love my job, and I am, yes, like I said, I'm driving home from it right now, talking about anatomy. So here we go. So when we are talking about female reproductive anatomy, we always want to start with the ovaries. Okay, so I'm gonna have a picture right here where my car seats were, and now hopefully you're seeing a picture of a uterus. So here we go. So we're gonna actually start with the ovaries. So the ovaries, a healthy woman will have 2 ovaries, and these ovaries contain all of the eggs that she will ever have in her life. What's really cool about this is that at 20 weeks gestation, so when a baby girl is 20 weeks still inside of her mother, she will have the most amount of eggs that she will ever have. And after that moment, then it's a matter of them being depleted. So they're either absorbed back into the bloodstream, or they are starting to be ovulated once she turns, 12, 13 and starts actually having a period and ovulating. So just to kind of put it in perspective for you, I'm currently 24 weeks pregnant with a girl. And so this baby girl has already almost lost some of her eggs. And that's just the natural way things go, right? So at 20 weeks gestation is the most amount of eggs that a girl will ever have. And then after that, they're depleted. And so another really cool thing to think about with this is that because a baby girl in gestation has those eggs already within her own little baby ovaries, right? That means that the mother of that baby girl is holding within her body half the DNA of her grandchildren. Okay, let's stop there and think about that, because that is so cool. So right now, my baby girl in my womb has a bunch of eggs in her own ovaries, and those eggs, if God willing that she has babies one day, one of those eggs, or maybe multiple of those eggs, are going to be half the DNA of my future grandchildren. So it's just crazy. It's just crazy. These are things we don't think about, and just how amazing just the gift of life is, and the gift of pregnancy is. It's just so cool. So anyways, we have the ovaries, right? 2 ovaries on either side of the reproductive system. Now, after that, connected to the ovaries are the fallopian tubes. And so a healthy girl will have 2 fallopian tubes connected to both ovaries. Now, on the end of these fallopian tubes are these little finger-like projections, and these are called fimbria. And so these fimbria, what they do is they kind of float over the ovary. So when at the time of ovulation, so ovulation is when an egg is released from the ovary. This should happen once every menstrual cycle. So at ovulation, when an egg is released from the ovary, the fimbria's job is to kind of swoop that egg into the fallopian tube. And so that's kind of how it transfers from the ovary to the fallopian tube. It's because of those finger-like projections called fimbria. So the fimbria swoop the egg into the fallopian tube, and the egg will then travel through the fallopian tube. If conception were to occur, it's actually going to be in the outer third of the fallopian tube. So in the part of the fallopian tube that's actually closer to the ovary than to the uterus, which is kind of cool. And then if a newly conceived life is, or if a new life is conceived in that outer third of the fallopian tube, it takes about 7 to 10 days for that new life to then travel through the fallopian tube and make its way into the uterus to implant. Another cool thing about the fallopian tubes is that inside of the fallopian tubes are also these little finger-like projections, not fimbria, that's on the end of the fallopian tube, but there are finger-like projections inside of the fallopian tube, and these are called cilia. So cilia are very important. These finger-like projections will move inside of the fallopian tube, and these are what is responsible for moving the egg, or if a newly conceived life is, keep saying that, if a new life is conceived, right, in that outer third of the fallopian tube, the cilia are what are responsible for pushing that new life, or again, like I said, if it's just the egg and no life was conceived, they're responsible for pushing that through the fallopian tube. So again, it takes about 7 to 10 days for a new life to travel through the fallopian tube and implant into the uterus. And so that's the work of the cilia. The cilia are what are pushing that new baby, that newly formed life through the fallopian tube. And it does the same thing with the egg. Now the egg, if it's not fertilized and so conception doesn't occur, that egg is gonna die within 24 hours of being ovulated. And so after that, again, it's either absorbed in the bloodstream or it's just passed through with the next period. But again, those cilia have a very important job of pushing it through the fallopian tube so it doesn't stay there. So we have 2 fallopian tubes on either side. Those fallopian tubes connect the ovary then to the uterus. So the uterus is kind of the shape of like an inverted pear, as you can kind of see. And the uterus is very stretchy. And the reason for that is because when a woman is pregnant with a baby, that is where the baby is housed for the 9 months of pregnancy. And so it needs to be stretchy to accommodate that growing baby inside of her. And so the uterus is gonna be very stretchy. And on the inside of the uterus, there's a uterine lining called the endometrium. And so this endometrium is a bunch of blood cells, and it thickens with every cycle. So when a woman has her period, after her period, estrogen starts to rise, and estrogen causes that endometrium or that uterine lining to start thickening. And then after ovulation, progesterone kicks in. That's the more dominant hormone in that post-ovulation phase, and progesterone continues to thicken the endometrium. And so if a woman is not pregnant, her body says, okay, I don't need this endometrium anymore, because the endometrium, that uterine lining, is where the baby would implant. This uterine lining is where, if a baby were to be conceived, this is where the baby would implant and receive nutrients from. And so if the woman's body recognizes, okay, I'm not pregnant, I don't need this uterine lining anymore, that uterine lining will shed, and that's when she has her next period. So that's what the bleeding from a period is it's that endometrium or that uterine lining. Again, it's a bunch of blood cells that thicken throughout a woman's cycle. And then it sheds with a period, and it starts all over again, right? A woman's fertility is cyclic. It goes on in cycles. So we have the uterus, we have the endometrium. Below that, we have what's called the cervix. I've done a whole video on cervix and cervical mucus. And so I'll link that above and in the notes below. But the cervix is hugely important. I mean, this whole thing is important, but the cervix is very important, the health of the cervix. So the cervix is kind of like a canal. It actually is a canal. It's a cervical canal. And so within the canal, you can kind of think about if a fist, right? I've got to keep one hand on the steering wheel, people, so I can't use both. But if you think about a fist, you know, there's like a canal within your fist, right? You can have like a little hole within your fist. This is kind of the cervix, right? And so the cervix is a canal, and within that canal, there are little crypts in between. And these crypts, they're called cervical crypts, and these crypts are what produce that cervical mucus. So the way that these crypts are producing mucus, it's all in response to estrogen and progesterone in your body. So your hormones speak directly to your cervix to tell it when to produce cervical mucus and when to stop that production. Again, I have a whole other video on this. It's I think it's very interesting. Hopefully you do too. And so we have the cervix, right? The cervix is hugely important for the sake of producing that cervical mucus. So that is right below the uterus. Then below that, we have the vaginal canal. So the vaginal canal is, again, just a canal that's right below that. That is the vagina. This is where a baby exits when she gives birth. And so this is also hugely important, right? So everything in this whole reproductive system is hugely important for the woman's reproductive system to be working the way that it should. It all is in response to hormones that are taking place, within the woman's body, from the brain to the ovaries. Another thing I forgot to mention about the ovaries is that the ovaries are what produce estrogen and progesterone. So those are those two main female sex hormones that kind of ebb and flow throughout the cycle. So estrogen and progesterone speak directly to these reproductive organs to tell it what to do and when to do it. So it's all working in conjunction together, right? The endometrium is building at the same time as the ovaries are producing estrogen, at the same time as the fallopian tubes are doing that. So everything is kind of working in conjunction with itself. Okay, so that was it. Short and simple video this week of talking about female reproductive anatomy, just really getting back to the basics of what this looks like for a healthy woman. And if you have any further questions or want more info about it, I have other videos that talk about the hormones, estrogen, progesterone, more in depth. Again, like I said, I talked more about cervical mucus with the cervix. It all works together in one fashion. It's really, really cool just how everything is in response to those same hormones, but they do different things. And they're all working in conjunction with each other. So it's just really beautiful the way that the female reproductive anatomy specifically is designed. It's so cool. So thanks for sticking with me on this ride, and I will see you again next week.